Good luck. Say again?
$10 million? How's that?
Yeah, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to the budget workshop of May 30th, 2019. It is now 9 a.m. I will call this meeting to order. I would also like to ask everyone that if you have a cell phone, please put it on silence or vibrate so that it doesn't interrupt our discussion this morning. Madam Clerk, would you please call roll?
Honorable Sandra Whitehead.
Aye.
Honorable Kathy Clark.
Aye.
Honorable Ralph Heisler.
Present.
Honorable Paul Baca is absent. Honorable George Sicketti.
Here.
Madam Mayor, we have a quorum.
Thank you. The item on the agenda this morning is under new business, item C1, resolution number 42-1819, adopting the fiscal year 2019-2020 preliminary budget. Morris Madrid, City Manager, you're on.
Mayor and Commissioners, thank you for accommodating us for this special meeting this morning. Before I start explaining dozens of numbers, I would like to have the management team, one at a time, stand up and introduce yourselves and which department you're with, please. OJ?
OJ Hensler, Parks and Rec. Jesse Cole, wastewater department. Bowling Green, Electric Department Manager.
Kyle Blacklock, City Pool.
Blair Wyman, the airport.
Farm River, the golf course. Benny Fuentes, Street Department.
Andy Alvarez, sanitation department.
Mayor and Commissioners, would you join me in applauding your management team?
Thank you, thank you. You guys are very valuable to our city.
They were an integral part of putting this budget together. We met sometimes 2 or 3 times, sometimes for 15 minutes, sometimes for an hour and a half. I think the only one missing is the chief, Norm. So with that, I'm going to step over there. Can you hear me? Good, okay. One thing that I want to do is mention a staff member that is not here, and that is because right now she is acting in another role in the support of payroll processing and review. So I threatened to have her come over here and embarrass her, but I let her off the hook at the last minute. I'm talking about Karen Salcido. She was instrumental and absolutely invaluable in putting this document together. The way that we went about this is she is familiar with the history of the city and its finances, all the different funds and fund types. She is also familiar with the DFA system and the processes and ways that these spreadsheets that you're going to see all tie together. We sat across from the table for weeks and went through each fund, each department, each line item, step by step. I had questions, she answered them. We needed a decision, I made it. And it went like that as much as we could until we were familiar enough to call the department heads in, consult with them, review the first draft. If it needed a little more work, we looked at a second draft. We had a final meeting day before yesterday for a final review in case there was any anomalies or any mistakes that came up. We found a couple of them, and I'll talk about those. They're very simple fixes. Before I get into the details, I want to explain the things that DFA looks for in a budget. Is number one, It's gotta be in the black. They will not approve a budget where you're projected to operate in a deficit. Not for the beginning of the year, not for the middle of the year, not for the end of the year. You have to operate at least at break even. The other thing is, it's gotta be balanced. It's like your personal checkbook. If it's not in balance, they're not gonna approve it. If you can't account for every dollar, they will not approve it. Those are the main things. There are other requirements that I'll explain. But those are the main highlights. What I'd like to do, with your permission, is to give you an overview of every area. In some places we'll be flipping pages together. Most of them will just be I'll explain the exceptions, the changes, and some of the areas that we were impacted by things that we couldn't control, and some of the changes that we made for things that we could control. So, with that, if you start off on page 1, I want to bring your attention to the first thing in the general fund, top line on the left, unaudited beginning cash balance. That number of $900,440, that number has to be 1/12 of our budgeted expenditures in the general fund. That's the minimum that they'll accept. In this case, it's double the requirement. It's over 2/12. The reason for that is they want to make sure that while you're generating revenues, that you can operate the first month. You have enough cash to operate that first month and generate the revenues during the year. So that's double the requirement. That'll be in our favor. We have the unreserved cash to be able to designate that. The next thing is, on the same line, net cash transfers of $1,176,373. Those are net cash transfers into the general fund. That amount has been cut from the previous year by about $180,000. The idea over the next few years is to reduce the dependency of the general fund on other funds, mainly the enterprise funds, and also to realign the costs to be allocated where they should be charged. One of the things that you'll see is in the governing body's budget and in the city manager's budget, we realigned the budget for attorney fees. They were all being charged to one place when the actual cost should be allocated to different places, such as city manager's office, community development, wherever the service was being performed. So, in addition to those numbers, I want to call your attention to, on page 2, the bottom line and the unaudited beginning cash balances and the investments. The $11,055,000 and the $5,363,000. Those are very good measures of an entity's financial position. That makes us very liquid and very solid. The pledged reserves of $1.3 million still leave us investments of over $4 million, some of which are designated, for example, in the enterprise funds, designated for system repair and replacement, or for other projects. You'll see that in some areas we don't have projects budgeted yet. We had been mainly relying on external funding to get projects done, and we've been using a lot of this funding. I mean relatively little, but this funding is being used primarily for leveraging and matching the funds that we've been granted. We have enough balances in there now to appropriate for our own internal projects. After our meeting yesterday, I have a better idea of what to bring to you for recommendations. And I'll be meeting with the department heads to get their priorities also. My recommendations to you for the final budget will be a combination of the two for discussion. And then we can incorporate those into the final budget. Again, this is a preliminary budget. The final budget will have actual cash balances, actual revenues, actual costs, for example, for general liability insurance, and final costs for employee health insurance. Those are some of the things that are not built into this budget right now because they're not final. So with that, I'm going to go to the summaries for the revenues in the general fund on page 3. You will see some anomalies that need to be increased. The building permits, right in the middle of the page, previously budgeted at 6,700, was only budgeted at 100. That's an oversight. In the fines and forfeits for court fines, that one was based on the trend that you can see in the previous years. And I don't know how this cycle works. The judge and I had a discussion on it, and I wasn't comfortable with leaving it at the same amount. So, because the numbers were so small, I estimated it low. That's why it's half of what it was in the previous years. All the other revenue line items are fairly stable. And you'll see on the next page, page 4, we have one line item that has increased a lot over the prior year. That's the assistance to small cities. That's based on local government's assessment of budgets and especially availability of money in the state general fund. That was increased to 400,000 because the estimate for this, the current fiscal year that we're in now, was 131,704. It turned out to be 383,000. And it's projected to rise probably another 100,000. I only projected 400,000. So that's going to be another big revenue in our favor. Again, it's tied to the economy. It may not be that way every year. So I don't think we have to plan on that one year to year. If you'll notice the subtotal in the general fund revenues right above grand total revenues, you'll see the percentage of 97.8. That means we only budgeted 97% of what we did last year in general fund revenues. The increase that you see is mainly due to the Small Cities Assistance Program. So, in compared to the cash balances and the reserve requirement, this budget is very conservative, and you'll see that in the expenses also. The next item are the transfers in to the general fund from other funds. The first one from the electric department has been reduced, you can see, from 1.65 million to 1.4 million. That's a decrease of 15%. The transfer from the water department has been cut in half from 100,000 to 50,000. The senior grant program transfer, that one has been eliminated, and that's just because we don't have a new agreement in place yet. That one may come back. Farther down to solid waste, that one was increased from 20,000 to 75,000 because, as you can see in the previous years, they hadn't made the transfer that's allowed by the ordinance. So these will continue to be realigned every year. This is not the way they'll stay. hopefully the trend will continue, including solid waste, that they be reduced every year, and we're less dependent on the enterprise funds in the general fund. The lodger's tax transfer, that was to support the salary of an employee that worked in the Civic Center. That was just reduced by $15,000 to start shifting that salary into the general fund from lodger's tax, even though it's allowable. If it's, I think it's important that we can place all the resources from lodger's tax into marketing and tourism that we can. And that was the reason for that reduction. The transfer from the solid waste collection center, that one will no longer exist. We have actually eliminated that fund for operating purposes next year. So that $20,000 is actually part of the $100,000 that you see in the solid waste fund number 505. On page 5, the recaps start for each department within the general fund. And I'll go through them one by one. The governing body budget was cut by $141,000, from $141,000 to $127,000. All the categories in there stayed pretty much the same, except for legal expenses. That's where that cut is coming from. In the city clerk's office, the budget stayed relatively the same, although the operating expenses increased somewhat. That's for the election. And in speaking with our clerk, that's one thing that we're going to budget for every year. And then even if we don't have an election, we're going to anticipate a special election and make sure that we don't have to move money around at the last minute. If we don't have any special elections, then we can redistribute that money later or not at all. In the city manager's budget, again there, some of the expenses have been reduced. The legal expenses are budgeted a lot less now. As a matter of fact, in the current year, the average has gone from about $11,000 a month to about $3,000 a month in over the last 6 months.
Excuse me, Manager Madrid.
Yes.
Can we back up and go to the court?
Sure.
It's just the next line item up. We skipped from city clerk to city manager.
Oh, I'm sorry. The operating expenses there, let me, at 41%, let me flip to the increase in that one is due to a $20,000 increase in the budget for public defender, and that was based on a recommendation from the municipal judge and the volume of and type of cases that she has. So that's where that increase comes from. In administrative services, there's a decrease in operating expenses. We've eliminated consulting contracts from there, but we have addressed the salaries. So we've moved budget from professional services into salaries and benefits. And I should go over how that has been working. For each department, a salary plan is developed down to the employee level. Employee by employee, objectives are set for qualifications, certification, so that over a period of time, the employees don't just develop seniority, they develop their capabilities. And increases in compensation are going to be based upon increases in capabilities and qualifications, certifications. I don't think that you'll see any, what they would be minimal cost of living increases anymore. Compensation will be based solely upon that. finance and some other areas, and I'll let you know which ones they are as we go along, actually have individual employee agreements in place that over this year, I will achieve this for this level of compensation, the next year, another one, or 5 years from now, another one, so that it's part of a whole development plan. And it just seems that to give the employees incentive to stay, they have to be assured that they have at least the opportunity to advance. And that shouldn't be dependent on inflation or being the city manager's favorite or politics or anything else. It should be something that can be reduced to an agreement. And that's what we're working on. In fire, those operating expenses are just carried forward. There's no change there. In police, there's a major change. And that major increase that you see in operating expenses, by the way, the police department has addressed their compensation. That's already in place for them. The increase in operating expense for the police department comes from more than doubling of the fee that we're going to be required to pay the Sierra County Dispatch Authority. That was based on the number of call volumes from over the last 2 years. The call volume has more than doubled, and I'm still trying to determine all the causes of that. Some of the causes are just because they do the dispatch for us in times of, if we have water breaks, power outages, they're the ones that dispatch our employees to investigate that. We may be able to find a different way of doing that, where the call volume doesn't count for that, and the dispatch is primarily for public safety. I'm not sure how the calls are counted yet, whether duplicates are counted or not. I need to investigate this a lot further, but that's where that comes from. That's really the only operating cost increase in the police department comes from that contract. And you can see it in the detail on their page, on the police department page later on. In community development, we left the salaries the same, knowing that we probably won't hire a building inspector. At this time, this department is a one-man show, and I think we see that at every council meeting from Tracy. Tracy has her development plan in place and is moving along and achieving those goals to the benefit of the city. That's a really good example of where we invest in the people that we have and develop them, and we get the benefit to the city is not only having better expertise in the staff, but we're saving money. And that's a real good example of
Manager
Yeah.
Madrid, we skipped animal control and Parks and Rec.
I'm sorry?
We skipped animal control and Parks and Rec.
Oh, okay. Right. In animal control, the operating expenses have gone up because now they're fully staffed. They have to be trained in a couple of different areas. One of them is the certification to do euthanizations, so that in the long run we don't have to pay a veterinarian for that. Right now that's being contracted out and it's kind of expensive. So we'll pay for that temporarily. We'll also need to make sure that they have the tools and supplies that they need. This won't be a trend. This is this is a one-time increase in outfitting and getting the animal control officers and the animal control staff certified and equipped. In Parks and Recreation, we are budgeting for more part-time help or full-time help. That we're going to have to be flexible with that, depending on the needs of the department. Because of the progress that's been made. I think this department has shown what it can do internally without having to contract out a lot of things. Recreation and streets, building services all work really well together. And the parks is one area where it's a quality of life issue. And because I think we can afford it, we're going to invest in it a little more and make some improvements in our parks. One thing that you see there is in the capital outlay, that's when the beautification grant is in there, and we've added a little more because that's projected to cover about half the cost of the complete remodel of Ralph Edwards Park. And that's going to be our priority for this year, including sprinkler systems. We're going to make it a better quality park, and hopefully we can get the public to use it in a better way. And we've discussed not being able to drive vehicles in the park, improving the sitting areas and shade areas, and making it just a more enjoyable place to be. So that's the reason for the increase there. And as a percentage, it looks like a lot. In dollars, a lot of that's being funded by the grant, so in actual dollars, it isn't that much. Community development, we went over. The street department. The street department does not have their compensation plan in place yet. That's why you see we've had some vacancy savings in there. So these numbers are just based on the current salaries. As a matter of fact, the street department, fleet maintenance, facility management, and the library are all in that same position. Some of these compensation plans will be implemented before July 1st. Some of them won't come until afterwards, but they'll all have the same methodology. As far as operating expenses go, they've stayed pretty static. And in the 1017, the gross receipts payments to the hospital, that's just carried forward every year at the same amount. On page 8, for the utility and insurance expenses, I don't have the actual numbers yet. We're projecting an increase of about 4%. It may be as little as 2, it may be as high as 7, depending on the ratings that we get and the final insurance rates that come out. The next section are the transfers out of the general fund. Now, these transfers are mainly to assist departments that don't generate enough revenue on their own. The first one that was a transfer is the corrections. That one, the 15,000 is just to supplement their budget for that amount. The gross receipts tax for the police department, that one is an anomaly because it's a reimbursement that needs to be made that was not going to be made this year. I could have handled this 2 ways. I could have transferred the cash immediately and showed the difference in cash on our first sheet that we looked at, or transferred it after where it's more appropriate, it's going to be spent. So this 147,000, of that 80,000 is a reimbursement. The normal recurring revenues are about 67 to 75. This number will change for final budget. In the municipal airport, that number was increased just because we're going to have more operating costs there. We're going to try and add another half-time person so that we can, in some ways we'll save a little bit of money. We'll reduce some of our overtime and some of our standby, but we'll have better availability of staff, and we'll be able to do more work at the airport and have more coverage there. We're anticipating that the activity at the airport is gonna increase a lot, so that's gonna mean it's gonna cost us a little bit more. Although the revenues there are gonna, projected to increase, we don't have enough history to be able to tell how much. So for now, we're increasing the transfer from the general fund because it's realistic. As we get better data and more revenue, we'll be able to reduce this, just not now. In the swimming pool, as long as we have the dome, the bubble, its costs are going to continue to just increase very rapidly and very high because of the utilities associated with it. I think that's one of the things, as we discussed yesterday, that we really need to review and perhaps find another way to keep the pool open year-round that's safer, less expensive, and just friendlier. So that'll be one of the priorities for this year. The last one is the repair and replacement at the airport. That one actually should probably be bigger. We do get some federal funding that we can use to address issues that we have at the airport in regards to runways, lighting, hangars, things like that. The airport needs some attention, and I know I can feel Blair's eyeballs in the back of my head right now.
You should see him from here.
So I can scream. I'm not going to scream, but yes, we recognize the airport does need some attention, and we need to continue towards that. Okay, now we get into the detail of the summaries that we just went over. So if you like, I can continue to flip through the pages, give you the individual line items. That'll probably take another, half hour or so, 20 minutes, but I think it would be worth it to go through at least the general fund departments. The other ones are very self-explanatory, but these ones are the day-to-day operations. And I'll start with the governing body. That's where you can see the reduction in the attorney fees. There is one item that's pending that I didn't reduce it in half, but compared to the actuals that we had for this year, we cut it by about 2/3. So this is that's a good start. The 15,000 is a good start. So that was the only area that was cut. Office, the agreements and contracts, I don't have any in place, so we didn't budget any. If we did need to, we will. That's a very small amount. In the city clerk's office, you'll see the only major change there is we budgeted for the election. Again, there is no compensation plan in place for the clerk and her staff yet. That's one that's in process, and we will see an increase in some of the personnel expenses there when we get that done. That one should be done before July 1st. In municipal court, as we saw before, there are main increases in the amount budgeted for the public defender from 9,000 to 20,000. That's on page 11. Other expenses remain pretty stable. In the city manager's office, I took a budget of 1,000 and converted that to 30,000 for legal services, just because that's where it should be. The attorney's fees are usually at my direction, so they should be in my budget. The non-capital equipment is a new computer. The increase in subscriptions and dues is for membership in the International City Managers Association. One thing that you would see throughout the whole budget that is new to everyone is the rental of equipment. It's for our copiers. Our copiers had been charged to capital line items previously, and we don't purchase them, we only lease them. And they're rental leases, so we're never going to own them. So throughout, you'll see brand new expenses for rental of equipment. Those are all copiers. In administrative services, their compensation plan is in place. Their personnel expenses have gone up. There's been reduction in other contractual services. In regard to the audit contract, that amount will stay the same. The other contractual is mainly for IT services. The entire 60,000 in that line item is for IT services. There are no financial consultant amounts budgeted for this year. Then again, you see that brand new rent of equipment down there near the bottom. Those are the material changes in administrative services. In the fire department, we had no change there, carried over the same number. In the police department, everything stayed fairly the same. Their salaries are already budgeted at the level they will be for next year. That line item, 599, other contractual services, that's where the agreement with the county is for the dispatch authority. That's where the increases in the budget. Everything else stayed fairly the same. We did increase the fuel cost just because they, compared to a year ago, they have gone up. In code enforcement and animal control, there's a couple of line items that need to be reviewed here. We had previously not budgeted any postage because that was, the postage meter was in our billing department, and that's where everything ran through. But it's not an accurate cost. It's kind of a minor thing, but we do want to get it right. This needs to be reviewed further. The 12,000 is just a temporary number until we get better information. In the area of field supplies, as I explained before, it's to better equip our animal control officers that we will have out in the field. And I think that's it there. In Parks and Recreation, page 17, you'll see that we budgeted more for personnel. We have not yet completed the compensation plan for the Parks Department. That one probably will not be till after July 1st. And again, we're just going to see some overall increased activity with another person and a bigger effort in the area of parks. The Parks Department has also supported and at times will continue to support the golf course. And that sharing of resources was a huge key to the improvements that we've made at the golf course. If we had not had the resources of the Parks Department, their expertise, and their general good attitude, we wouldn't have accomplished anything at the golf course. We would have accomplished something. But what you can do with 5 people and 5 pieces of equipment is a lot different than what you can only do with 2 people that have never done it before by themselves. So not only has the Parks Department been a good support resource for the golf course, it's been a good mentoring for the golf course too. And then again, you see that the beautification grant was budgeted within this department. So that shows a big increase there. That's mainly going to be for Ralph Edwards Park. And community development, as I said before, we have the compensation plan in place. We did not reduce the salaries, even though we probably will not hire a building inspector. These salaries, if we need more, would be transferred down to the professional services, which we increased from 20,000 to 35,000. These are mainly for engineers to do plan review when we have developments or even major construction projects that require plan review that we don't have the staff to do. And it's either an architect or an engineer stamp that we're looking for. So that's what that's for. In general, let's see. We did increase employee training. That's to go with the additional expertise that we expect Tracy to acquire. And that'll be in the budget every year from now on. The street department does not have the compensation plan in place yet. We do have a draft of a plan that I have reviewed with HR. This budget will be increased in personnel and benefits, so that will go up with the final budget. Other than that, this department doesn't have a very huge budget because most of the operating expenses come from the street fund. Mainly it's the salaries that are budgeted here that come from the general fund. In our fleet maintenance division, we are going to have 2 employees there, plus another half FTE for administrative support. The compensation plan for these employees is not in place yet. We didn't put it in here, and I'm looking for something that I missed. We will have one equipment purchase of a new tire changer. That'll be probably under 10,000, but it'll be included in the final. So that should have been here. In facility management, they also do not have their compensation plan in place. Personnel expenses will go up. All the other expenses stayed overall. In operating expenses, they stayed exactly the same. And I just cannot remember what the 32,000 was for in capital. A new truck. Yes, okay. So it's to buy a new vehicle for the facility management department, which is badly needed. Okay. In the library, not one penny should have been changed. There was a reduction in the personnel expenses. That was my oversight. We need to restore that to exactly where they've been. They do not have their compensation plan in place yet either. So you'll see a small increase in their salaries and benefits. The hospital payments are budgeted at the same level. On page 24, these numbers are just estimates for the purpose of submitting it in the preliminary budget. We don't have these final numbers for property insurance, liability, and vehicle insurance yet. When those numbers come in, we'll put them in the final budget along with the final cash balances. That's the general fund. That's the main one. Any questions before we go on to the special revenue?
Manager Madrid, I do have one question going back to the beginning. Hold on just a second. on the governing body, I know that we just approved, the commission just approved increases for, the commission in after future elections. Is
Right.
that, identified in the budget this?
No, because it won't take effect during this fiscal year. It's not budgeted.
Okay, all right.
Mayor, if you don't mind, I have a couple of questions too.
Okay, go ahead.
Manager, back on page 4. At the top under miscellaneous revenue, it's standing out to me that maybe there was an error in 21718 when vending was 72,000 and now it's 1,000. Did we have something else that was plugged in on that revenue number in 18? I don't suspect that you're going to have that answer, but it looks weird to me.
I think it was a fee for a major development. That,
As
that's all right,
revenue?
Tracy? In 1718, was there a major development, fee?
For
Came
vending
in?
and concession. Does that ring a bell to you?
I have to read the folder, but I think so.
Yeah, it's in miscellaneous, so.
It-
It could have been an insurance claim, it could have been a refund of some type. That would be something that doesn't fit anywhere else.
Okay, so it's just a standalone one-time thing, probably. Page 10. On, just out of curiosity, and maybe clerk can answer this one, but when we did that special election, it cost us $11,000. Where did we move that money from? I'm just curious, how did we fund that when we didn't have it budgeted into the budget to make that special election?
I can answer that, Mr. Moderator, if that's okay.
Yeah,
There is one pending budget adjustment that hasn't gone through. It's been submitted, and I imagine Mr. Madrid will probably put that with the final.
we have one huge budget adjustment that needs to be approved by the end of the year that we're still working on. And it's to make sure that the departments, individually do not finish in the red. In general, we won't, but some of the over expenditures have not been accommodated with a budget adjustment. And attorney's fees is a good one. We way exceeded our attorney fees for the current year. Other professional services is another one. Utilities is another one. They're mainly costs that can't be controlled but should be budgeted. And really, what we should have done was done a mid-year review and adjusted the budgets accordingly for the rest of the year. We didn't do that. So this final budget adjustment is going to be a catch-up cleanup that we normally wouldn't do. There are budget adjustments throughout the year, but this one is going to be a big one, and it's a catch-up and cleanup.
There should have been like 8,500 done for the initial request for the special election. So the additional to close out the over 12,000 that it actually costed is pretty too.
Yeah. The only other question the only question I had was on page 12. Under professional services. And we've gone up to 30,000 from 1,000. And do we have, is that by any chance, can you tell me what's on that line item, just off the top of your head?
That's mainly going to be legal services,
That's what I figured.
and hopefully that's the budget for the entire year.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay. On page 25, this is where our special revenue funds begin. These are the summaries. Most of them are very simple. Some of them don't have any activity or just exist because they're required. For example, At the bottom of page 25, you'll see the Law Enforcement Protection Fund. Those are required to be in a separate fund. They're very small expenditures. They're used for the same type of supplies and expenses for the police department every year. But going back to the top, the State Fire Fund. Those revenues are budgeted at the anticipated level. They vary very little. The chief's projections have been almost dead on for the last 3 years, I understand. And these have been accumulating in a fund balance in order to buy a new fire truck. And I think this is the year that the fire truck will be purchased. Here, Chief?
Yes, sir.
Is that correct?
Yeah, we hope to pay cash for $700,000. We've been saving our shackles.
We've been watching you do that.
Yeah.
Nice work.
Well,
What a
we
good
might need
job.
grant to actually get it done, but in the meantime, we have plan B.
So that's what that major expenditure is for, and you know, you rarely see that. You rarely see in government someone being responsible to save money and pay cash. You're always seeing leveraging and loans, and my compliments, Chief.
Thank you.
In the recreation fund itself, we're incorporating all the expenses, hopefully into the general fund. We're not gonna budget anything in the recreation fund this year. Those revenues have been, minimal and have not had any impact anyway. In the correction fund, those ones, are mainly, they're flow-through funds, and, they just have to be budgeted. They're minimal impact on anything that we do. The Law Enforcement Protection Fund is a distribution fund from the state, much like the State Fire Fund that you see higher. The Law Enforcement Protection Fund is a lot smaller, and the chief incorporates this money into his training and equipping, supplying of the police department. They're all budgeted in the operating expenses. In the donations account, this one is going to account for any donations for the police department or the animal shelter. There were other cash accounts that were open. We're going to close those so we don't have different ones for different purposes. If they're not required by the state or federal government to be open, we're going to close them and incorporate them all together in here, for the police department anyway. We will still accept donations that are designated if the donor says, I'm going to give you $50,000 for temporary cat cages, then we will consider that and consider those restricted, and we'll still be able to follow them through the system and consider them to be restricted. We just won't have another cash account and another fund for that. Our system allows us to do that type of costing. As an example, we would just add a temporary line item for the revenue, saying cat cage donation, $50,000. A capital improvement at the bottom, cat cage purchase, $50,000. It would be in place for that 1 year. The following year, it would still show us history. The year after that, it would disappear. So that's how we're going to handle a lot of the temporary and minor revenues and expenditures that we have. The Police Department Confidential Fund is one that we're going to incorporate into the general operating fund of the police department. This one has not been used. The cash account has been stagnant for about 4 or 5 years. So after this year, we will be eliminating this fund entirely. The gross receipts tax fund, this is the one, as you can see there, the revenues there and the expenditures are not projected, because we do those as the gross receipts tax distribution comes in. So when we project our gross receipts for next year, for the final budget, those revenues will be projected. And as I told you before, the transfer from the general fund is shown here within that 116,000. That reimbursement will come in. The total available in that gross receipts fund next year will be close to $400,000. So it will be made whole again. And it involves two things, transferring the cash and reestablishing the budget. So I think I'll work closely with the chief on that to find out how this GRT can be allocated for the police department. The lodger's tax. These are estimated based on the prior year's trends. You can see that the transfer out has been reduced by 15,000, as we discussed before. The operating expenses have been increased, and the capital outlay has been decreased. And mainly, those were for projects that I don't know why the 71 was budgeted there last year. I couldn't find a reason to keep that in place, so that was reduced to a little under 20,000. But these are also estimated on a more conservative basis. For the final budget, they may come in closer to 375, 385,000. That will be reflected in the final budget. In municipal streets, those are budgeted at a little bit lower level because we're not sure how the DOT is going to distribute their money. The local government road funds dropped a lot. The Department of Transportation seems to be realigning how they distribute these funds. This one is probably a little conservative and will go up for the final. We have a meeting with DOT in the next couple of weeks, and we'll find out how they're going to handle those. You'll see that they're all, almost all, designated for either projects that we have planned or as for matching funds for projects that we're going to get funded for. So we can use it for either one. This amount gives us the flexibility to do either one. The swimming pool. The swimming pool has had more demand, has had more increase in their operating expenses, and just is dependent on the general fund. It's that simple. I don't think that increasing the fees from what they are now would really make a difference anyway in the funding. It would just be an additional burden mainly to the youth, which wouldn't help. It wouldn't help the pool at all. So we might as well just face the fact that we got to pay for the pool from the general fund. We just need to find a better way to do it, and a better facility to do it with. I'm not saying a new one, but a better one. In the library fund, the revenues, although they're small, keep going up, and they were budgeted at a little higher level, and that's just completely based on a trend. The operating expenses were budgeted accordingly, just so that they're equal to the revenues. We're not required to keep any reserves in there. The Veterans Wall Perpetual Care, this fund is one that will be eliminated and combined with their capital improvement fund, so that the care of the wall on a routine basis is primarily done by volunteers, And any funding that would come through the city would be focused primarily on improvements to be made to the facility and to the park area. The federal seizure fund is another one that we're targeted to close. We haven't had any activity in there. If we need it, if we're going to participate in any federal seizure programs, we could open a fund if we needed to. On a smaller scale, we could incorporate it into the police department itself. That's the recap for all the special revenue funds. They're fairly simple. Then, I won't go through the detail on the special revenue funds. The following, let me see how many pages. Following pages up through up to 41 are the details of the recap that we just went through. Next are the enterprise funds. The first one is the cemetery fund. The cemetery fund is fairly small. The revenues are estimated based on activity and just show a very small upward trend that it seems to be in cycles, and I couldn't identify what that 3-year cycle is due to, but that's a very small increase, and so are the expenses. The joint utility office. This one is the projection is for more activity. The personnel has been adjusted and is in place. Our expenditures are all funded by transfers in, and some of the cash reserves that are there. There's not a major change in there except for the personnel expenses. In the electric division, and this is our biggest one, revenues are projected to rise. These are conservative also. The operating expenses are expected to rise also because we pay for the electricity that we sell. That's the primary factor. The salary plan has been put in place in the electric department, so the personnel services will go up, as will the total expenditures. The total revenues will also. In our water department, we're estimating a slight increase in revenues, and again, these are conservative for the preliminary budget, just based on the ordinance alone that allows for a 5% increase in the rates every year. We could estimate the revenues 5% higher every year. We didn't do that in the preliminary budget. We want to make sure that all of the final costs and cash balances are in line before we do that. The personnel and personnel services, we have reduced the, and this is for water and wastewater, we had a lot more directors. We had 2 directors instead of 1. We only have 1 now. We've eliminated a director position in there. Jesse has taken over both departments. We're going to have supervisors within each department, but we're able to run with less FTEs in both water and wastewater. That's where you see the reduction in personnel. In solid waste revenues continue to rise. Their operating expenses have been budgeted for the activity. They were they are not projected to double. This budget last year was severely under budgeted. The actuals were nowhere near $500,000. The operating costs are increasing based on an actual basis by less than 5%. I don't know why it was under budgeted, but that anomaly that you see in the doubling of operating expenses is not a true picture of what's been in place. We are anticipating some increases based on fuel and personnel, but other than that, the only thing that we'll see is we'll need to continuously keep our equipment up to date, especially the bins themselves, the collection bins themselves. That's where the capital expenditures come from. In wastewater, you'll see the same thing, an increase in the revenues and a small decrease in their personnel services. The operating expenses are going to go up. In wastewater, we're going to transition from external testing to the internal testing for the water quality and wastewater monitoring. So that's one change that you'll be seeing in the next year. And overall, the budget was a minor increase. And again, all the enterprise funds, as long as they operate on their own, if they have the revenues to support their increasing costs, then we do budget at a higher level. And that's just, it's always going to be the trend just because the operating costs keep rising. One thing that I will say about the enterprise funds now is that I think in water and wastewater over the next year, those are a couple of the funds that we should review for adequacy of the rates. Are we capturing the revenues that we need to, and are we costing things the way that we should? Are we matching our revenues with our operations? And I think they don't have to be complicated, but they do need to be reviewed. The 5% every year is not going to account for fuel and equipment. One thing that we do need to do, and we started this year, that is we need to always abide by the 2.5% requirement for every budget to set aside for system repair and replacement. That is within all of the enterprise fund budgets, and that should be built into our rate structure also. And I don't know that it's there now. I don't see it. And our rate structure should be identifiable just to the average customer, so they'll know part of my bill goes here, part of my bill goes here, part of my bill goes here. And we should be able to do that. And a lot you'll see in Fund 507, that's going away. That has been combined. And that's part of the reason that you saw the solid waste division expenses double. Those expenses have been brought in here from solid waste, the collection, and combined with the regular operating. So we're going to eliminate that fund. It's not required by any agency, by any funding entity, by anybody that we borrowed money from. They're not required to be together, and we can account for the expenses line item by line item and generate reports when we need to. The next one, and this one was a surprise when we formulated it, the golf course. The golf course, we really took back, me personally not knowing what to expect. From what we have developed, and I'll go into a little bit of detail on this, the revenues were estimated based on over the last 8 years, we did have the data on the number of rounds played. And that was from the best condition of the golf course down to okay, and then good, and then terrible. Right now, we have, for February, March, and April, I think in the golf course we have decent. So we took decent and compared that to great, terrible, good, and came up with, in 1 year, there was 11,000 rounds of golf played. That was a great year. In another year, there was only 2,900. This year, we're projecting conservatively, I think, about 4,000 rounds to be played. That's a little less than half of a wonderful year. And I think we're going to exceed that. But again, we wanted to be conservative because we don't have that much data. So we took those and projected the revenue based on that. We did leave the transfer from lodger's tax in there. That's the 55,000. But including that in our projected revenues and incorporating the ideas that Bart and OJ helped with us also a lot, we'll be able to at least break even on the golf course this year while we're progressing. We'll see how that goes. I hate to say profit. I think it's too soon, but I think I can comfortably say that the golf course will not be a huge burden on the city, and we can look forward to a lot better times. And thanks to Bart and OJ. The airport, I think, is going to be one of the gems that we have to develop over the next few years. I think it's going to be a resource that's going to be well utilized in economic development, in tourism, and even in our relationship with a spaceport. It's an element that I think we need to give a lot more attention to, and we will. The transfer from the general fund is necessary, and that's what we use to balance this budget. We do have some plans there for improvements, especially to the hangars, to make it a friendlier place to be, so we can get more traffic there. The cemetery fund is very static, very small, and we basically left it alone and budgeted what we have in prior years, and are not going to make any changes there. The joint utility office we went through. The personnel expenses are a little bit higher, along with some of the benefits go up in relation to the salaries. As far as the operating costs, those have been reduced mainly to reallocation of, I think the biggest one is probably the postage. You'll notice a line item there that I think I and anyone else involved in government administration needs to see: miscellaneous expenses. That's a red flag for any auditor or anybody. If it doesn't fit in your budget, what are you charging there? We're eliminating miscellaneous expenses in every budget. So we eliminated it in this one. The electric division, other than accounting for the increase in revenues, we have adjusted the personnel compensation plan is in place there. That's reflected in the personnel expenses and benefits. As far as the operating expenditures, they stayed fairly static. The maintenance of infrastructure has gone up just because of the cost of the materials associated with that. In the capital outlay, you'll see $400,000. That's part of the cost of the new meter reading system that we want to acquire. That process is already in place. I think we've received the deadline, I think, just passed for questions on the RFP. The RFP has been issued, and that conversion will take place in the coming fiscal year. So, in the electric division transfers, there's the other side to the transfer that goes from electric to the general fund. There's also the transfer to the joint utility office. That's to support the billing, meter reading, and all the things that are not done directly from the electric department, but for administrative support. The electrical construction and capital improvement, those are for future construction and repair and replacement of the system. The electrical repair reserves, that $10,000 is within the ordinance that I really don't understand. That's part of the ordinance that needs to be addressed, because it should be either a percentage of revenues or a number a lot higher than $10,000. We could save 50 years, 10,000 at a time, and it wouldn't make a big impact in the electric department. So that's one of the things that we need to review within the ordinance itself. The water division stayed fairly static. We even saw some savings again in personnel and in their operations. The water division, I think, is one of the ones that needs a rate review. We generally look for outside sources to fund improvements to the system. We're going to continue to do that. But I think that we also need to take a look internally at some of the reserves that we have developed and develop priorities for those two, so that we can come back and appropriate that money and make improvements to the system that are going to be the quickest and highest impact, to reduce leaks, to make our delivery more efficient, to anything that would improve the service and save system loss. The system loss in our water department is a big issue. Again, if you see, if you look at the expenses, the main increase is for system maintenance, and that's something that had been under budgeted the previous years. That line item historically has been overrun every year, so we're just bringing that back up to a level where it should be. And the transfers out, again, you can see the side to the opposite side. From the general fund, there's $50,000 from the water fund to the general fund. There's $59,000 from water to joint utility, the administrative support. The capital improvement, and this is per the city code, the ordinance, is the $23,787. The amount required for debt service, these are on loans that we already have in place for the water department that need to be paid back. Those go to the debt service funds, and that amounts to $254,000. And then there's that $10,000 emergency repair fund also. There are some funds in there, and for emergency repairs that require overtime, I think one thing that we probably haven't done, we haven't used any of these emergency repair funds to reimburse the budgets for overtime, extra materials. If we had to pay a contractor to dig up a line and replace half a block for $50,000 or $100,000, we should utilize these funds a little more effectively. We haven't done that. On page 52, you see the solid waste division with the transfer station. The reason that you see it in this format is because there's no history for it. You would have to combine the solid waste division and the transfer station operations in the previous two funds to see that. So this is the first year that you'll have no history. In future years, you'll have the history. So overall, if you took this and compared it to the other two, you'd still have a static budget. The compensation plans have not been implemented in this division, so the personnel expenses are understated. Those will go up with the final budget. The pages 54, 55, 56, and 57 are there just for your information in case you want to compare the new solid waste budget to the previous ones. On page 58, wastewater division. These have partial implementation of their compensation packages. So those, the revenues are projected based on just a very simple trend. They'll probably go up to at least a 5%. In the personnel expenses, those will go up when we complete the compensation plan package for wastewater. Other than that, the only major changes was in the maintenance and professional services, and those will be for any consulting engineers that we might have. We do need to do some analysis on the system itself. Once it's 100% operational and we have phase 2 going, this budget will need to be reviewed again to accommodate the new levels that we'll be operating at once phase 2 is complete. Again, at the bottom you see the transfers, the 109,740 going to the utility support for the administrative services for building and things like that. The capital improvement, that's required for debt service. The debt service for the USDA loan, wastewater treatment plant, that's a bridge loan. That's done in two pieces. There's a loan to cover the expenses until the grant is finalized. Once the grant is finalized, this loan will be set aside and paid off, and all the debt service will go to pay back the big loan for USDA. The 100,000 to the general fund, that's the one that has been reduced, and then the other ones that are required by the code and to go to reserves, those are in there. The joint utility reserve, for some reason, does not include the wastewater division, but it should. And that where you see the reference to a joint utility reserve, that's one of the things that we will be eliminating, because the joint utility designation, I think, was created in order so that outside entities would look at the city of Truth and Consequences and see all the utilities as a whole, one joint utility. But what that does is it kind of dims the light on the both efficiency of the high performers in enterprise funds and disguises the low performers, when they should all be performing not necessarily equally, but efficiently. So I think doing away with the joint utility designation will make our enterprise funds more, not only presentable, but more accountable and more efficient in the way that we operate. Because we do need to consider them separate operations, even though we share resources once in a while. The golf course. The golf course, I think, in actual number of rounds, we estimated, I think it's 240 a month, which is only about 8 rounds a day. This does not include any of the other types of revenues that we can generate using the clubhouse and selling items in the clubhouse. It doesn't include revenues that we can generate from the liquor license. This is really a worst case budget. I don't know that we'll have a very sound budget for the clubhouse or for the liquor license by the final budget. That's probably going to be a budget adjustment after we develop a little bit of history. In any case, the idea is to have one full-time person, one part-time person, and then seasonal help as we need it in the golf course. I think one of the things that we'll need to do is remember that this is not the plan. This is not a permanent plan. This is a starting point, and we won't have a full season complete at the golf course until October or November. Our mid-year budget for the golf course is going to be a point where we can determine a lot better what our future path is out there. The airport, you can see some of the increases in the revenues that we're looking at. We've kept them fairly static. The only increase really is the transfer in from the general fund. Personnel expenses are expected to rise. The benefits accordingly. We kept the expenditures at about the same level until we can develop a little bit more history, along with the revenues. The revenues at the airport are real conservative, and I think we can expect to generate a lot more revenues than that. When we do have enough history to make that adjustment, then we will. And I think we may see some ongoing budget adjustments next fiscal year. We may do one every quarter. They may be small, or they could be very large depending on the activity out there. But the budget historically has not been realistic there. And I think this is a realistic budget, and it's conservative, but it's only gonna get better with the operations. Now, the last main section, and I don't know if you want to review the debt service funds later, on page 64, start the capital projects funds. In water and wastewater, electrical construction, in water and wastewater, those are going to be budgeted when the grant becomes final, and I think we have, we're close to having a construction document in place. At that point, we'll set the budget for that project. That's going to be one of the major ones. It's not included here, not until we have a document that's final. In the electrical department, we have an estimated amount for this year. This is not the AMI project, this is ongoing improvements to the system. And that's an estimated amount that'll probably go up during the year. In the Veterans Wall, this is one that was just estimated based on a couple of pending things that have not been done since, I think it was, since the wall was constructed a couple of years ago. That's what I understand. And there's just some things that need to be completed there. The senior state grant and the capital improvement general. The capital improvement in general, we're going to try and stay away from, because we want to budget the funds within the appropriate department. And even though there'll be non-general fund revenues, we want to show the activity where it belongs and give the directors the information within their funds, instead of having to determine, well, which part of this is streets and which part of it is building maintenance and which part of it is water. We shouldn't have to do that. In this current year, we have some funds that needed to be carried over and expended, and those will be transferred in and expended in the right place. But you won't see that recurring. Golf course improvement fund, we didn't budget anything in there yet. We do have a cash balance in there, and we have started to account for that dollar. That's where it comes from. It comes from the dollar for every round played. And hopefully, because this is one fund that we work with the Golf Association to determine what the needs are at the golf course. So that budget won't be created until I consult with them. Won't be a big amount, but it'll help. The street sweeper, that's been purchased and paid for, and we can eliminate that fund. The wastewater treatment plant, this is where the next phase of the improvements is going to be, and this is the amount that was approved by USDA. This amount does not include the allowance for contingencies. This is just a basic amount. This could go up by over $500,000 once we determine what things are optional. This is not the full funding. What other improvements can we make? They're identified, they're costed, and they're built into the contract. We'll come back with budget adjustments to increase this project amount. The emergency fund. I could not determine what that would be used for, and I couldn't see any historical expenses from it. So that one is going to be targeted for elimination. The sewer repair replacement fund, that one already has another fund for system maintenance and repair. So this one is only being budgeted so that we can, I'm not even sure where the revenues come from, but we left it in there to be able to collect the revenues and then transfer them into the operating fund or the replacement fund where they can be used. The next one is the airport one, and these revenues are expected to go a lot higher. Last year they were underprojected by a lot, and I don't know why. The capital outlay is going to include some FAA funding, and that should all take place in this current fiscal year, in the next current fiscal year. In 313, 314, and 315, The CDBG project is closed. The 313 fund has not been utilized. The 315 fund has not been utilized. The transfers that you see going in there in this fiscal year went in and out. And they didn't go for this purpose. So we're eliminating the use of those funds. They're redundant. The emergency repair reserves. Here's another fund that has not been used historically, but here's where you see the $10,000 requirement that's supposed to go to the reserve account. That's what these are. It's a requirement by ordinance. It doesn't really have a designation yet, but one thing that I need to do is to determine what the accumulation has been of transfers to these reserves and determine how much is available for system repair and improvements now for the next year. And I'll bring that back to you for prioritization. The 301 is another fund. We had to leave that in because there are some CDs from water and wastewater that have been designated for the interest to come into this fund. We can't eliminate this fund until we change that designation on the investments. That's the only reason that you see this fund in here. And the electrical construction, that's for the transfer in mainly is to, because the budget for debt service on some of the loans in the electrical department were put here in the electrical capital outlay fund. They do not belong here. I just didn't have the time and the knowledge to move them somewhere else. I don't know why DFA accepted these. They should have been placed in a different fund. In the final budget, these expenses will be in a debt service fund, not in a construction fund. Page 72, you see TUC 6. That's a reference to an MFA loan number, and that's where the 118,000 comes from. The Veterans Wall on page 73. Again, those are residual costs that need to be spent. I know that I've met with Maggie a few times. Some of the stones need to be stained. I think she wanted to make some changes to the lighting, the baskets. There's a bunch of smaller items that won't be over 10,000 that we need to get done over there. That's what these are for. Once this is done, we can probably close out this fund also. The senior state grant, this one was opened. I don't know whether the city actually administered the senior citizens funding from the state. It looks like they did. And at that point, it had to have its own fund. We don't do that anymore directly, so we don't need this fund. It's another one for elimination. Capital improvement general, is the same thing. Capital improvement from the joint utility. Now here's another one that's budgeted to pay debt service. You'll see at the bottom where we have debt service principal and interest, and on page 77 you'll see the loans with the NMFA TRC 2, TRC 17, 18, 19, 22, and so on, that have to be paid from here. These transfers should be made into debt service funds, not capital outlay funds. That's a correction that needs to be made. I just didn't have time to make it before this budget was due. And again, there's a golf course improvement fund that will be one that will be in the final budget and will be adjusted as we go along, as we collect money and make more improvements to the golf course. Those need to be prioritized. At Capital Improvement Fund 308 is one that may no longer be used. 309 is the USDA project that will be ongoing for a while, and I've explained where that funding comes from. This one is properly budgeted for capital outlay. You do see some debt service principal and interest in there. That is appropriate because that is a bridge loan. It is not a permanent debt service that will be paid after the project is completed. That debt service payments on that won't commence until after the project is fully complete and accepted. These are the interim payments for the bridge loan that was taken out. And that's you see the loan summary there on page 81. And here the emergency repair fund. We're still complying with the ordinance, but we're not putting it in this repair fund anymore. They should be, the transfers from the enterprise funds should go into an enterprise fund reserve. This is not an enterprise fund reserve fund. This one will be eliminated. The repair and replacement for the sewer, this is another one that has investments and reserves, and the interest and earnings are designated to come to this identified by fund. Until we actually redirect the interest income, we have to keep this fund open. And here's a more detailed description of the revenues and expenditures for the airport. You'll see that the federal grant for the electrical vault and the match is up in the revenue section and is budgeted for capital outlay improvements for the airport. And we're supplementing that with some money from the general fund for $11,919. This is the type of budgeting that we can do so that we can have multiple projects in one fund instead of having a fund for every project. You can see that the revenues from FAA are designated on the line item. You see that the project itself is designated on the line item. That's the detail that we need. If we need further detail, we can generate that from the Tyler system using our special reporting features. They don't all need to be in their own fund. And again, we have the funds that are no longer necessary: 313, 314, 315, and 316 needs to be there. It's got investment income. Same thing with 317, 318. The LIDA fund is no longer active and can be closed. Now, the trust and agency funds. Trust and agency funds are funds that we either hold for others or generate internally and redistribute. The court bonds is a trust and agency fund, and those are normally bonds that are posted and held and then refunded on behalf of municipal court. I don't know how people bond out, but this fund is not being used. That may be a function that has been taken on by the municipal court, which is fine. They have the ability to do that. But it's, number one, it's not necessary to budget those things because they're in and out. They're not true expenditures. So this one, I don't think you'll ever see budgeted. But if we have an account set up for that, we have to disclose it. The internal service fund. This is mainly for the fleet maintenance center. And this is one that I think we need to review. We are using it. I don't know if we're using it effectively, but it does need to be reviewed to make sure that we're capturing all the costs and allocating them properly. It's a very small thing, but we will need to address that in the next year. You can see on page 93 the expenses, and they're mainly for parts and equipment for the vehicles that we have. The debt service recap is, the first one is a 403. These are pledged taxes that we have to go towards the loans that you see on page 96. You see the intercept funds, NMFA gross receipts tax intercepts. Those are the intercepts are funds that are collected by taxation and revenue, normally get distributed to cities and counties and schools. Well, in these particular cases, as part of the loan agreements, we agree that when taxation and revenue makes the collections, that they intercept and keep that money. That way, they're assured of collection, and we don't have to deal with sending them payments every month. That's what those are. And those are for the purposes, some are familiar with the police department building, the solid waste. I'm not sure what some of the other ones are. We're going to look at realigning a lot of these to save money, as we did with one group of them already, and either combining and extending or paying off early and finding new funding for some of the priorities that we talked about yesterday. The final schedule and the biggest headache, I think I had to apologize a couple of times for my language to Karen. Not directed at her, but directed at this stupid schedule. Because if it doesn't balance, DFA goes, nice cover, and they go to the last page. And on page 100, if there is a positive or negative number there below, if they don't balance, they don't even look at the rest of the budget. This is a recap of all of the transfers in and out of all of the funds. So where you saw the recap for the general fund, you'll see the net numbers in and out. You'll see the same thing for corrections. For any fund that has a transfer in and out, this is a recap of those, so that if you added all of them up, your last number would be 0. If you summed all the transfers in and out, your last number would be 0. I'm glad to say that it is a nice big fat 0. And I don't drink, but I went and I had a couple of little bottle cokes when I finished this thing. That is your preliminary fiscal year 1920 budget. And if there's any questions, we'll answer them. If you have any detailed questions, there's the whole management team here.
Good job.
Thank you.
I have a couple of comments.
It was a group effort.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem.
Just one real quick question. It's not a real concern or anything, but there are a lot of changes in the formatting that we're doing on these budgets.
Yes.
And just out of a question to you, and I appreciate the fact that you have both sides of the story, both the municipal and the DFA, but when we send this up there to them, are they going to be asking questions of you, and is it going to be a problem Or is it just gonna be understood that it's being, reformatted in some areas?
No, I'm sure that we'll get at least a phone call,
Okay,
and I expect that we'll have our DFA analyst on one end of the phone and myself on the other end. What did you do here on page 75? Especially in regard to eliminating a fund. We did ask these questions in advance as we were formulating the budget. We intend to do this, is this okay? We want to eliminate some cash accounts, is this okay? So, we did get their guidance in advance. They had one of their analysts that was doing training in the area, and he came by and met with Karen, one time here, another time in Williamsburg, to show exactly what we were doing. So, yeah, there will be questions, and hopefully they'll be pleased with what we're doing.
okay, so they're anticipating this.
Yes.
Do you think that it's worth our while to take a look at these emergency repair fund ordinances?
Yes.
Okay. The other comment that I wanted to make, Mayor, is, I think we're very fortunate to have Manager Madrid with the kind of understanding and knowledge that he has of finance. And I also want to, thank the department heads of this city, for working so closely with them. And, I think you've, done an extraordinary job trying not only to do this, budget, knowing that Manager Madrid's only been here for 5 months, but that each one of you are taking such personal responsibility for your departments and making it want to be yours. And it's pretty evident. And from a commissioner's standpoint, it's really nice to see. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. We do have one more question. Hold on just a
Yeah,
second.
Manager Madrid, page 73.
Okay.
Expenses should include, on page 73, a new column variant for the weapons vault.
I'm sorry?
The expenses should include a new columbarium for the veterans vault.
It should be a beginning balance.
Well, I can kind of clarify that.
Right, please do that.
The clerk's office handles all the cemetery plots and such, and also with the Veterans Wall and the columbarium. And I know that, if Maggie didn't mention it, that we have been tasked with getting, starting to look into a new columbarium, because we have reserved all the niches in the current one. There's probably about maybe 15 that haven't passed away. So we have the tubes in the clerk's office. And also there was somewhere else where there was a percentage for funeral expense and such. And we also, would help to take a look at that, so we make sure that it's budgeted, because it wasn't this year. When, a veteran reserves a niche, they, they do it from our office, we reserve it, we have it all ready for them. When they pass away, the family notifies us, we get with Carricos, and, actually Carricos isn't the agency, it's actually, Billy Carricos, that the columbarium or the veterans contract with to do the cremation and the interment in the urn. And if they ask for services, that's that line item that's in there. But it's all paid through the city. So the family pays just like the cemetery, the open and close type of thing. And so, I just want to be sure that we include those expenses in there.
What about the revenues? I don't see any revenues.
Well, right now, those are sold. Those are all sold, so there wouldn't be additional revenues unless we get a new columbarium.
Right, but I don't see any historically for the last few years.
There should have been. Yeah, there should have been. So we can look up, we'll get with Angela and Chelsea and see what code has been used and what line item it was designated to.
Okay, because
So
we'll
we
need
just want
to
to make sure
determine,
that those are in here somewhere.
yeah,
Well,
because,
let's go ahead and review that and look into that, and if it needs to be taken care of, then we can adjust it accordingly. But we need to always have and make sure that we have an audit trail of paperwork or some kind of information stating the way that it's been done in the past. Because according to this, it doesn't look like it's ever been done.
And I'm not, su- you know, and it's, I brought to him different
Right,
budgets all the way through the budget that we might have one or two things on.
Okay.
And, I don't know why, but for some reason, this one hasn't really popped out at us, other than, it's because it's labeled a veteran's wall.
Okay.
yeah, and not even in review of the cash accounts
Yeah.
did it come out. So there's cash in here somewhere.
Okay.
So it's
But we
something
need to
that
cut out-
Right, yeah, and we will. We'll go ahead and review that and see what we can come up with and what we can find, and then we'll adjust it accordingly and make it right.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Any other comments? Any other concerns? Do any of you, department heads, would you guys like to make any comments? Do you have any questions? Do you feel comfortable with the budget? Are you happy with the way things are going? I mean, you know, we've always got some ideas of doing things better, but we have to work within the confines of our money that we have. You guys are all doing a great job, hear good things out there. So if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to comment. If not, I will stand for a motion to approve resolution number 42-1819, adopting the fiscal year 2019-2020 preliminary budget as presented by Manager Norris Madrid and with the help of the department heads.
Motion made.
Motion made? And motion made and seconded. Madam Clerk, would you please call roll?
Honorable Senator Whitehead,
Aye.
Honorable Kathy Clark,
Aye.
Honorable Ralph Heischler,
Aye.
Honorable Paul Bucker is absent, Honorable George Segedi.
Aye.
Motion carries. Again, I want to thank each and every one of you. This is just a preliminary. We will have final numbers hopefully at the end of June. I like the idea that Manager Madrid presented out there, that we will look at midterm, mid-year, and make any necessary adjustments as needed at that time, instead of waiting till now to make the big adjustments. So thank you. Thank you all, and you all deserve a real round of applause. All right, I move we adjourn.
Second hour.
We're out of here. Bye. Thank you, I just didn't quite understand that. I'm sorry. Oh, I knew it was, but I didn't know, yeah, so this is step. Right, well, thank you. And this is step government, if you have questions, you kind of go ahead and go ahead, yeah. Because you're just as valuable as anybody else. So, yeah, and so, you know, it's kind of hard for me and Ron, and it was kind of like, they work together. Yeah.
I know he's,
Well, and I never got my hard copy.
So, yeah, anytime you have a question to say,
Different presiding officers.
no, and I don't mind, I prefer that. So, anytime you have a question or an idea or a thought, just say, none here. I would like to bring this to the attention of, you know, okay? I don't bite. I want to do that.
And lots of originals and some other stuff, originals. The resolutions are here for him because it has to be distributed.
So we have to sign?
By June 1st. And there's some others I haven't tabbed, but you're pretty good about just going page by page.
Hey, Jesse. How are you, sir? Good, how are you?
make sure it's locked.